Thank you very much for attending the session. As Graham says, I will be talking for about 15 minutes. I'll be talking about democratisation in theory briefly, and we'll give our example of practice. So our example of practice will be taken largely from a 5-year ASRC-funded consortium titled Imagine, Connecting Communities Through Research. And this has involved people from a number of different universities and sort of has emerged with the context of the growth of inclusive research, the debates about methodological consequence and REF's impact agenda. So this is ongoing at the moment. So the specific piece of research is taken from Imagine's 4th research package, and this falls into the democratic strand. The board research question is written out here. We're questioning how can connected communities be conceptualised, researched and promoted so they have the potential to accommodate accommodate and benefit from social, cultural and economic differences and diverse opinions. So within this then, we work with community partners to see the reactions to research outputs, to reveal what this means about the democratisation of knowledge of communities means in practice. So this was an example. So I think the first sort of question is, what do we mean by the term democracy? And very helpfully, I'm not even going to define that. So basically because there's such a wealth of literature in political science and sociology. So it's defined in a number of different ways. And on here we can see that there's some sort of models of democracy, so there's understanding of democracy in that sense. And what do we mean by the term democratisation? This is also very hotly contested, but here we have democratisation means a net movement towards a broader, more equal and more protected process. So I think the real key here is that democracy is really hard to define and in doing so really hard to measure as well. In terms of research methods, it's been noted that participation rates in conventional research have been declining, and that many people now perhaps decline to take part in research because they just don't see the point in the research, or they might not see the benefit of the research to themselves. So democratisation has also been driven by the desire to give voice to previously excluded groups. And so it's become seen that the more democratic research is the research where there's these conversations between the researcher and the researched, rather than this sort of one-way stream of traffic coming from the researcher themselves. And this has been taken a step further, where people actually become agents of their own inquiry. So the role of the researcher then is, it's less needed as people start to do research themselves. And as Graham mentioned, that we need to sort of think about how technology has helped this and how it's given voice to previously silenced groups. So as he said that, Twitter might be one way this has occurred. But I think we need to question how appropriate Twitter is as a tool for that. So the process of democratisation can sort of be crudely categorised into these types of research, which can also map alongside how participants have been conceptualised in research. I think Ed's going to talk a little bit about this as well in his talk a bit later on. But you can see that the process of democratisation has seen research move through phases. So we have research that was done on what we termed research objects, through to research for research subjects, to research with participants, and even research by co-researchers or by people themselves. So this was a super brief introduction to democracy and democratisation in theory, and we just sort of wanted to demonstrate how there's been a change in user involvement, and that increasing user involvement has now become to be seen as the most democratic form of research. So on to our example of practice. What we wanted to do is to work with community partners, and in order to achieve this, we drew up this information sheet there on the right-hand side, and popped it into the delegates pack of the Community Partners Summit, which was held in Bristol last year, and we were just going to wait to see if we had any responses from that. which we did. So we had 4 responses from various community groups that are located in different parts of England. And you can see here they also have different interests. So we have a youth group, a community theatre group, and 2 local history groups. So what we asked each of these groups to do was to evaluate a set of research outputs generated from community research. And the task was nothing more than sort of tell us how useful and interesting, or not, the research outputs are from a community partner's point of view. So what we were concerned with finding out was who reads the outputs, and do the outputs actually feed into anything practical for the communities themselves. I'm not expecting you to be able to read this one, by the way. Just an illustration of just the wealth of different types of projects that are out there. So what we did is, in order for the task to go ahead, we collated some research outputs from research conducted as part of the Connected Communities programme and the South East Coastal Communities projects. So there were a potential of over 300 different projects to choose from, and we sort of chose somewhere between, I think, about 83 actually, projects. And they were chosen primarily because they were available to us. So of these 83 projects, the community partners had to pick a few based on their titles and brief project descriptions, and then they had to go on and evaluate each of the research outputs generated from these projects. So typically, community partners chose between 4 and 10, depending on how many people were working on it, 4 and 10 projects, and then went on to evaluate how useful or interesting or not the outputs were from those projects. So what I just wanted to do now is just give 4 examples of projects, just to give a flavour of the variety of outputs and the type of projects that take part in community research. Although only 83 projects were chosen and given to our community partners, we were pretty confident that there would be topics that would be attractive to each of the community partners. So, for example, this one had a history element to it, so there's a chance that it would have been quite appealing to either of our history groups. So linking communities to historic environments brought experts, which are people from national organisations, and practitioners, community participants who are interested in historic environments, to come together and to share their experiences about a given location. So linking communities to historic environments, one of the research outputs there was this discussion paper, which was fairly lengthy, but it was available to anybody via the Connected Communities website. This one here is an example of an output in the form of a website. So Mr. Seal's Garden, it was a project based in Liverpool that mapped where food used to be grown, where it came from, and what they were doing is they were hoping to inspire people to come up with innovative ways and ideas about where food can be grown today in a really overpopulated area. So what they've done is, off the back of that, they've got this website up, which has various tools on it, including sort of a map of Liverpool as it, many years ago, and sort of documenting where food used to be grown, but also more practical tips on how to grow food and sort of ideas about where you might do it if you're limited for space, along with recipes, so it's a very interactive tool. So we've got a discussion paper and a website, and already 2 quite different range of topics. So we've got history and a gardening project, and we also chose a youth project, which I think is familiar to at least 2 people in the audience. So this is an example of a project that tackles youth issues, and we were fairly confident that people would be interested in this, not just for itself, but because many community groups do actively work with children. But primarily also, I've chosen this because it was an example of a research study that has been picked up by the national newspapers, and that's sort of another form of output. So I think what Graham and Dawn's up there as well did with other people from Kent is go to Sheppey and ask young people about their imagined futures. And then, as you can see in the Guardian May last year, they drew upon that research to write an article. So my final example of an output is meetings and events, such as this one. So Our Space was a project that developed both virtual and physical spaces for deaf and hard of hearing groups to come together. And these are places where people come together for social events. And again, we felt fairly confident that this had a brief of, that because communities have a brief of bringing people together, that this would sort of be of interest to some people, because this is what they're doing here. They're bringing people together in a space that they feel comfortable in, socially together and physically. So they were just 4 brief examples of different types of projects and different types of outputs. So what we asked our community groups were to evaluate them, as I've said, but we envisaged that perhaps the outputs from these projects might fall into any one of these 4 categories. And naturally, perhaps the most desirable for each of us sitting here is the useful and interesting box. We would hope our research falls there. But there's a danger that it might also be very interesting to people, but not particularly useful. But it might be useful, but not very interesting. And I think the one that we all hope to avoid is producing research that is neither interesting or useful. So once the community partners had evaluated their projects, Graham and I went along to interview them and to speak to them a little bit further to sort of understand how they come to their decisions. So what we found was, even though we only had 4 community partner organisations, that there was difference emerged. And so we have 4 issues that came through this. The first issue is representativeness. Who gets a voice? Who takes part in research? Who's speaking on behalf of the communities? And you can sort of see what one participant said about this. The second issue then was that of accessibility of the research outputs. One person commented that outputs had to be clear, and if they had clarity, that this quite often aided interest. This helped make them more interesting. What was picked up by another person was that they praised some outputs for being rather punchy and easy to read, which in turn again made them quite accessible. Another, though, drew attention to the difficulty of sort of this balance between needing some outputs to be written, but that some people might struggle with this and might not be able to access them. But there was this difficulty of having a research output that was accessible but without dumbing it down. So again, you can just briefly see what they've said on the slide there. So this second issue led on to the third issue of purpose. So what purpose do the outputs serve for the community organisations? Some people said that the larger documents wouldn't be very useful because people just wouldn't bother reading them. And that some outputs would spark an interest because they can see that it might be useful to them. The other issue is to think, when we're talking about community organisations, is that actually quite a lot of their time is focused on securing funding just for mere survival. So although an output might be very useful, very interesting, if it's not useful, then that's no good to them, because as you can read here, one person said, you're not going to pull out a Judith Butler quote to secure your next local authority grant. So it doesn't matter how interesting it is, if it's not useful, have they got time to read it? And so there was this particular concentration on the issues of outputs being useful rather than interesting, as outputs need to have benefits to the community itself, and quite directly. One person highlighted the value of a toolkit, saying that useful outputs would help project planning or funded bids. So this is the idea of outputs actually serving a purpose to the community themselves. So what was clear then was there was a larger emphasis on the transfers of skills than the transfer of knowledge. And the example here shows that one person found that reading a participatory research was very useful because it enabled them to see how it was done so that they themselves could do it. It was clear that usefulness was more apparent when there was a point of connection, and some people chose to read and evaluate projects they knew some things about. So we sort of anticipated this when we were collecting them, but many people did actually choose something that they had prior involvement in or they had already had an interest in. So local history groups did actually tend to choose projects that had a history element to it. And similarly, people sort of stayed clear of those projects that they felt they already didn't know anything about. The fourth and final issue is sort of that of problematic research relationships. So if the community partners had past experience of a problematic relationship, this meant that trust had to be re-established in the present. There were experience shared with us that researchers would just come in and sort of take from the community without giving anything back, and that's quite damaging. And this, for us, highlighted the need for research to be informed by democratic values, for there to be a real equal relationship. So you can see here that although, as one person comments, that they did research with the university, they felt that all the outputs were actually just for the university and they didn't get anything from them. Super record time, this is my last slide. So in summary, the exercise highlighted that the issue of who speaks to the community is never far away, and that research outputs need to be accessible both in their format and quite literally. People need to know where to go to get the outputs in order for them to be useful. And although it was recognised that useful and interesting could coexist and they could go together, there was a particular more emphasis and weight attached to research outputs being useful. So my final comment is that community-university relationships require trust, and this takes time to build, but it can be quite easily broken if the process isn't formed by democratic values. So I would urge everybody to tread carefully so you don't spoil it for the rest of us. We've just got a few references here, but I think you can access them online.